Picture the satellite image everyone has seen. South Korea at night, lit up like a circuit board, cities bleeding into each other in a glow of light. And then, just above the border, a black hole. No highways of light, no clusters of cities, almost nothing. Just one dim point where Pyongyang sits, alone, in the dark. That image has become shorthand for how the world understands North Korea. A country switched off. An economy so isolated, so sanctioned, so starved of trade that it barely counts as an economy at all. A place that makes almost nothing the rest of the world wants, sells almost nothing anyone can legally buy, and survives, if it survives at all, on handouts from Beijing and the sheer stubbornness of a regime that would rather starve than change. Here's the problem with that picture. In the last 3 years, without lifting a single sanction, without opening a single border crossing, without changing its ideology by one word, North Korea has quietly generated more foreign currency than at almost any point in its history. It has funded a nuclear arsenal, expanded a missile program, and built new military factories, all while the average North Korean farmer still cannot reliably feed a family through the winter. The lights are still off in the satellite photo. The money, somehow, is not. This is not a story about ideology. It is a story about plumbing. Somewhere underneath the dark satellite image, there are pipes carrying cash into Pyongyang that most sanctions regimes were never built to see, let alone stop. To understand North Korea, you do not need to understand Juche philosophy or the personality cult. You need to follow the money, and the money tells a much stranger story than the darkness suggests. For most of its existence, North Korea has run on a very simple design. The state owns everything. The state plans everything. The state distributes everything, from grain to housing to jobs, through a system of rations and quotas inherited almost unchanged from the 1950s. On paper, nobody buys or sells anything. The government decides what gets built, who builds it, and who receives it. It is called self-reliance, and for about 3 decades it more or less worked, propped up by cheap oil and subsidized trade from the Soviet Union. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared, and it took the subsidies with it. Fertilizer shipments stopped. Fuel shipments stopped. Machinery stopped getting spare parts. Farms that depended on Soviet-made tractors and Soviet-priced fuel collapsed within a few growing seasons. By the mid-1990s, the public distribution system, the entire mechanism that was supposed to feed the country, simply failed to deliver. Estimates of the resulting famine vary widely, but even conservative figures put the death toll in the hundreds of thousands, and some estimates run into the millions. North Koreans call it the arduous march. It is the single most important economic event in the country's modern history, and almost everything about how the regime makes money today traces back to what happened next. When the state could no longer feed people, people started feeding themselves. Illegally at first. Farmers sold surplus vegetables on the roadside. Factory workers, no longer receiving wages because their factories had no fuel to run, started trading whatever they could find. Small markets appeared on the edges of cities, tolerated because the alternative was mass starvation and the regime knew it. Those markets are called Jangmadong, and 40 years after the state promised to make private trade unnecessary, they are now the thing keeping a large share of the population alive. Here is where the first reversal shows up. North Korea presents itself to the world as the last true command economy, a place where the state controls production and distribution from top to bottom. Underneath that image, independent surveys of North Korean households and defectors have consistently found that somewhere between half and three-quarters of an average family's income now comes not from state wages, but from market activity the state does not officially run. Trading, small manufacturing, transport, informal services. The government did not defeat the market. It learned to tax it instead, quietly, through bribes, stall fees, and selective enforcement. The command economy that Pyongyang advertises to its own citizens is, in large part, a shell sitting on top of a black market the state depends on and periodically tries to strangle. That tension has not gone away. In recent years, the regime has moved to reassert control over the very markets that kept people alive after the famine. Merchants describe waves of crackdowns, tighter restrictions on cross-border smuggling with China, and a shrinking of the class of wealthy traders known as donju, the money masters who emerged from Jangmadong trading to become North Korea's closest thing to a merchant class. Some analysts estimate that a majority of these once thriving trading networks have been squeezed out or forced underground over the past several years as the state tries again to move people back toward rationing and centralized distribution. It is the same pattern repeating: tolerate the market when the state cannot feed people, then try to reclaim control the moment it can find another source of revenue. And that is exactly what has been happening. The state has found another source of revenue, a much bigger one, and it does not run through the Jangmadong at all. To understand where that revenue comes from, you have to look past the farmers' markets and toward a very different kind of economic actor. An office inside the ruling party whose entire job for decades has been generating hard currency for the leadership, outside the normal state budget, outside international scrutiny, and increasingly, outside the reach of sanctions altogether. Analysts often refer to this apparatus loosely as Office 39, a name that has become shorthand for the constellation of state trading companies, banks, and front operations that exist for one purpose: bring in dollars, euros, and now, increasingly, cryptocurrency by whatever means available. For years, that meant fairly traditional smuggling: methamphetamine production, counterfeit cigarettes, and the famous super notes, near-perfect forged $100 bills good enough to fool sorting machines at international banks. It meant exporting laborers, tens of thousands of North Korean workers sent abroad, mostly to China and Russia, to work in construction, logging, and restaurants, with the overwhelming majority of their wages seized by the state before the workers ever saw them. Those programs still exist in modified form, but over the last decade, the center of gravity has shifted somewhere much harder to police: the internet. North Korean state-sponsored hacking groups, tracked under names like Lazarus and Trader, have turned cryptocurrency theft into what independent blockchain analytics firms now describe, without much exaggeration, as an industrialized state revenue stream. In 2025 alone, groups linked to North Korea were responsible for a record share of the value stolen in crypto hacks worldwide, with several independent tracking firms placing that share somewhere between 60 and 76% of total global losses for the year. The single largest incident was the February 2025 breach of the Dubai-based exchange Bybit, in which hackers exploited a compromised signing interface to drain roughly $1.5 billion in Ethereum from a cold wallet in a matter of minutes, the largest cryptocurrency theft in history before or since. Cumulative estimates of what North Korea has stolen through crypto hacking since 2017 now run past $6.5 billion. Here is where the machine gets interesting. A hacked exchange is not by itself useful to Pyongyang. Stolen Ethereum does not buy fuel or fertilizer. The actual business is what happens in the weeks after the theft. A structured laundering pipeline, documented in detail by blockchain investigators, that typically unfolds over about 45 days. In the first few days, funds get scattered across decentralized exchanges and mixing services to break the trail. In the following week, they move through smaller exchanges and cross-chain bridges. In the final stretch, they get converted through networks of Chinese language brokers and over-the-counter traders in the Asia-Pacific region into cash or assets Pyongyang can actually use. It is, in effect, a fully vertically integrated business: theft, laundering, and conversion, run by a state that treats cybercrime the way an ordinary country might treat an export industry. Even that, though, is not the largest new pipe feeding the regime. The biggest one opened in 2022, and it has nothing to do with hacking at all. It has to do with a war 3,000 kilometers away in Ukraine. When Russia's stockpiles of artillery shells began running low in its war against Ukraine, it turned to one of the only countries in the world, both willing and able to supply munitions at scale without worrying about Western sanctions, because it was already sanctioned to the hilt: North Korea. Ukrainian intelligence estimates suggest North Korean-made shells have accounted for as much as half of Russia's needs for 122 and 152 millimeter artillery ammunition at various points in the war. South Korean government-linked research institutes, Drawing on satellite imagery of container shipments across the Russia-North Korea border, estimate that North Korea shipped well over 15,000 containers of munitions to Russia between 2023 and early 2025 alone, potentially delivering millions of rounds of ammunition. Then Pyongyang went further. Starting in late 2024, it began sending soldiers, not just shells. Estimates of the deployment range from around 10,000 to over 20,000 troops, sent to support Russian operations, most notably in the Kursk region, after Ukraine's incursion there. Multiple South Korean intelligence assessments put North Korea's total earnings from this combination of arms exports and troop deployment between August 2023 and the end of 2025, somewhere between roughly $7.5 billion and $22 billion, depending on the estimate and what forms of compensation are counted, cash, oil, food, and military technology transfers among them. Before getting to what that revenue actually means, it is worth pausing on what running a state like this costs in the first place, because the entry price of the North Korean model is rarely discussed the way the entry price of a business would be. Keeping a population of 26 million inside a closed information system requires an enormous, permanent fixed cost, a surveillance and internal security apparatus that has to monitor movement, communication, and even radio dials. Since North Korean radios are manufactured to receive only state-approved frequencies, it requires maintaining one of the largest standing armies on Earth relative to population, roughly 1.3 million active personnel, plus reserves that can be mobilized into the millions, none of whom are optional expenses that shrink in a bad year. It requires running parallel elite enclaves in Pyongyang with reliable electricity, imported goods, and new luxury housing developments to keep the loyalty of the political and military class the regime actually depends on to stay in power. None of this shows up as a line item anyone can audit, because there is no published budget worth trusting. But it is there, accumulating every single day, whether the harvest is good or the hackers had a slow month. Sit with that range for a second, because the scale is the entire point. North Korea's own nominal GDP, by the most widely cited outside estimate, is somewhere around $30 to $40 billion a year for a population of over 26 million people. A single wartime relationship with Russia, running for roughly 2.5 years, generated revenue equivalent to somewhere between a fifth and more than half of an entire year's economic output, concentrated almost entirely in the hands of the state and its military-industrial complex. One national security research institute in Seoul went so far as to note that if North Korea collects the full value of what it is owed for this cooperation, the core economic effect of decades of international sanctions, the deliberate strangling of Pyongyang's access to foreign currency, would be functionally neutralized. This is the reversal the whole story has been building toward. The public image is a hermit kingdom, cut off from the world economy by design and by punishment, surviving on rice, propaganda, and Chinese charity. The hidden reality is a regime that has built, almost by accident, a diversified revenue portfolio that would not look entirely out of place on a corporate balance sheet. A domestic informal retail sector it taxes but does not fully control, a globally distributed cybercrime operation that outperforms most nation-state hacking programs on Earth, a labor export business that quietly extracts wages from tens of thousands of overseas workers, and now, the largest line item of all, a wartime arms and mercenary relationship with a fellow pariah state that happens to be fighting the largest land war in Europe since 1945. Sanctions were designed to close one door. North Korea did not need to reopen it. It found 4 others. It is worth doing the arithmetic on just one small piece of this system, because the unit economics are almost obscene. Take a single North Korean soldier deployed to fight in Kursk. Multiple reports put his monthly wage, paid by Russia to the North Korean state, at roughly $2,000. Additional payments are reportedly made if that soldier is killed. Multiply $2,000 by even a conservative estimate of 10,000 deployed troops, and you get $20 million a month flowing into Pyongyang from wages alone before counting a single artillery shell. Annualize that, and troop deployment by itself, according to some estimates, could generate over $500 million a year if the arrangement continues, a recurring revenue line with none of the volatility of hacking or the enforcement risk of Jangmadang trading. It is the closest thing North Korea has ever had to a subscription business. A standing supply of soldiers priced by the month, sold to a buyer that keeps needing more. Now widen the lens from one soldier to the whole shipment side of the relationship. Multiple South Korean assessments put the value of North Korean munitions exports to Russia between August 2023 and the end of 2025, somewhere between $7 and $14 billion, an average estimate landing around $10 billion. Divide that by the roughly 15,000 shipping containers believed to have crossed the border carrying that ammunition, and each container represents, on average, somewhere in the range of $500,000 to nearly $1 million of value to the regime. Delivered not as promises or diplomatic goodwill, but largely as advanced weapons technology, fuel, and food that keep the system running without ever touching a bank that could freeze it. Compare that to what a Jangmadang trader earns hauling goods across an internal checkpoint for a season, often described by defectors and researchers as somewhere in the range of a few dollars a day after bribes. The disparity in scale is not incremental. It is the difference between a rounding error and the entire line item. This is the part that rarely makes it into the popular image of North Korea. The country that supposedly cannot produce anything the world wants has become, almost overnight, one of the more important munitions suppliers in a major European war, priced and shipped with the kind of container logistics any exporting nation would recognize. Set that against the human ledger. South Korean intelligence assessments have suggested casualty rates among some North Korean units deployed near the front lines reaching as high as 40%, killed or wounded. The soldiers themselves see almost none of the money directly. Like the overseas laborers sent to logging camps and restaurants for decades before them, their wages are collected by the state, and what filters down to families back home, if anything does at all, is a fraction of the total. The revenue is real. The recipient of that revenue is not the person generating it. None of this means the underlying economy is healthy. It means the underlying economy has found ways to route around its own dysfunction. The formal state sector, the collective farms, the state-run factories, the rationing system that Juche philosophy was built to defend, is still, by most outside assessments, barely functional. Agriculture still accounts for a large share of the workforce in GDP, but the country regularly cannot feed itself without imports or aid, a persistent failure across nearly 3 decades since the famine. Roughly 40 to 60% of national output, by the estimates of outside defense analysts, still gets funneled toward the military and the nuclear program, a share almost unmatched anywhere else on Earth, even as the regime's own official figures claim a much smaller number. That spending does not stop when the money coming in slows down. Nuclear facilities do not go on standby. Missile programs do not pause for a bad quarter. The military-first economy has one direction: forward, regardless of what the harvest looks like or whether the Jangmadang had a good year. This is where the failure chain becomes visible, even if it is not fully played out yet. Imagine the war in Ukraine ends through negotiated settlement or exhaustion on either side. Russia's demand for North Korean shells and soldiers drops sharply because a peacetime Russian army does not need the same flow of ammunition a wartime one does. The largest single revenue pipe Pyongyang has built in a generation narrows, possibly overnight. The regime, having grown accustomed to a level of hard currency inflow it has not seen in decades, needs to replace that revenue somewhere. It leans harder on the 2 other pipes it has: cryptocurrency theft and Jangmadang taxation. But both of those pipes are already under pressure. Blockchain tracking firms have built increasingly sophisticated cross-exchange alert networks specifically designed to flag North Korean-linked wallets the moment stolen funds move, compressing the laundering window and raising the cost of every future heist. And the domestic merchant class, the Donju who once thrived on Jangmadang trade, has already been substantially weakened by years of crackdowns, a shrinking of exactly the private economic activity the state might need to lean on again if its wartime windfall dries up. Each backup system is less robust than it was a decade ago, at precisely the moment the state may need all 3 functioning at once. The case that makes this abstract mechanism concrete is the Bybit hack itself. In February 2025, hackers linked to North Korea compromised a signing interface used by a third-party wallet provider connected to the exchange, allowing them to authorize a transfer that looked routine to the system approving it. In minutes, roughly $1.5 billion in Ethereum moved out of what should have been one of the most secure cold storage systems. In the crypto industry, within days the funds were already fragmenting across dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of wallets, moving through decentralized exchanges and cross-chain bridges specifically chosen because no single operator was willing, or in some cases able, to freeze the transfers. Within roughly 45 days, by the estimate of the analysts who tracked the money, a meaningful share of the theft had been converted into cash usable by the regime. The warning signal, the trigger event, the exploitation of a technical weak point, the laundering cascade, and the final conversion into hard currency. Every link in that chain happened without North Korea ever touching a physical border, and without a single sanctions officer anywhere in the world having the ability to intervene in real time. It is the clearest possible demonstration of why a country that cannot legally export much of anything can still behave, financially, like a mid-sized exporting nation. So who actually captures the value in this system? Not the North Korean soldier sending shells to the front, whose wages are collected by the state before he sees them. Not the North Korean laborer in a restaurant kitchen in northeast China, whose paycheck largely disappears into state accounts. Not, for the most part, the ordinary Jangmadang trader who operates under constant threat of confiscation and bribery, demands from local officials. The revenue concentrates almost entirely at the top. The leadership circle in Pyongyang, the military-industrial complex that both consumes the Russian weapons technology flowing back in return and controls the factories now expanding to keep the arms pipeline running, and the state trading apparatus that has spent decades building the laundering networks needed to turn stolen crypto and smuggled shells into usable dollars. Russia, on the other side of the relationship, gets something arguably even more valuable than the shells themselves: a steady wartime supply chain. It does not have to build domestically, bought at a price far below what its own defense industry would charge, paid for in a currency, geopolitical dependency, that costs Moscow very little compared to cash. There is a second business hiding inside all of this that rarely gets discussed on its own terms, and it may be the most durable one of all: technology transfer. Multiple assessments suggest that in exchange for shells, ammunition, and soldiers, Russia has provided North Korea with advanced military technology it could not otherwise access under sanctions, potentially including satellite, missile guidance, and submarine technology. If accurate, this means the true value of the Russia relationship to Pyongyang is not fully captured by the dollar estimates at all. North Korea may be trading a renewable, low-cost resource, artillery shells, it can keep manufacturing, and soldiers it can keep training, for a non-renewable, high-value one: weapons technology that would otherwise take the country years and billions of dollars of its own research to develop. That is the kind of trade that keeps paying dividends long after the war that created it has ended. Now run the two scenarios side by side, because the gap between them is the real story of where North Korea's economy goes next. In the good scenario, the war grinds on, or a new conflict opens up demand for North Korean munitions and manpower elsewhere. Hard currency keeps flowing in from Moscow. Crypto theft continues at its current record pace because global exchange security has not caught up. And Jangmadang, even weakened, keeps enough of the population fed that internal unrest stays contained. Under this scenario, North Korea, one of the poorest countries on Earth by conventional measures, keeps funding one of the most active nuclear and missile programs on Earth, with sanctions doing less and less to stop it every year. In the bad scenario, the war ends, exchange security catches up to North Korean hacking tactics faster than the regime can adapt its methods, and the crackdown on domestic markets continues squeezing the one source of income ordinary households actually control. Three revenue streams narrow at once, right as decades of underinvestment in agriculture and civilian infrastructure catch up with a population that has never fully recovered from the famine of the 1990s. The state does not collapse in this scenario. Regimes built the way North Korea's is rarely collapse from economic pressure alone, But the gap between what the leadership can afford and what it insists on affording, the missiles, the warheads, the palaces, widens, and it is ordinary people, not the elite, who absorb that gap first, the way they always have. So, back to the satellite photograph. The darkness over North Korea was never really a sign that nothing was happening there. It was a sign that almost nothing happening there was visible from the outside, measured in the currencies and channels the rest of the world knows how to track. Underneath that darkness, for the better part of 30 years, a state that could not feed its own people built four separate, largely invisible ways to extract hard currency from a world that was actively trying to cut it off. A domestic black market it learned to tax instead of destroy, a state hacking operation that now accounts for a majority of all cryptocurrency theft on Earth, a labor export system that quietly extracts wages from tens of thousands of workers abroad, and most recently and most lucratively, a wartime partnership that may be worth more to Pyongyang in raw dollars than its own economy produces in most years. The lights are still off in the photograph. That was never really the point. The economy did not need to be visible to be real. It only needed somewhere to send the money, and someone else's war turned out to be exactly that.